Day to see you. Yesterday, we have received more than 400 participants from several regions has registered this webinar. It's a really lot of number. And now together that we can also see the amount of participants join this room, we have 140 more. And so now on, while waiting the other participants joining this room, a quick reminder that the opening of webinar will begin shortly. Thus, I would like to inform you about several rules that must be obeyed throughout the event. First, every participant must change their display name first by using this format, name_institution. And second, every participant must change their microphone muted and also keep the cameras on throughout the event. And next, we would like to inform you that there will be a question and answer session at the end of each session. Therefore, if you'd like to ask some question, you can write down your question on the chat box and not to forget to mention your name and also institution. And secondly, you can click the raise hand feature, and after the moderator pick the questioner, please unmute your microphone. And the last is because we are in the international webinar, we please you to try to use English language, but don't worry, you can also use Bahasa, and I will help you to translate it. Last it, I would like to inform you that this webinar is in collaboration with SDG Center University of Pajajaran, Kementerian PPN or Bappenas, Forum Kebijakan Ketenagakerjaan, and Indonesia Bureau of Economic Research. And this webinar also streamed on YouTube, so maybe you can invite your friends or institution member to watch together from our YouTube channel. All right, that's all of the rules that every participant must follow during today's webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, as the event will begin in any minute, we encourage all participants to be ready and have everything prepared. And hopefully that all of us could get the special experience on this extraordinary event, because the pandemic is not stopping us to be connected to each other and passionately productive towards the distance. Therefore, once again, we would like to welcome you all to this room on this special occasion. The Honorable Minister of National Development Planning or Bappenas of the Republic Indonesia, Dr. Esi Suarso Monoarfa, the Honorable Director of SDG Center, University of Pajajaran, Professor Dr. Zuziana, to all panelists and honorable guests, and to our beloved participant. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Yamita Bunga as your Master of Ceremony today. Welcome you to the international webinar on building a good jobs economy through productivity LED structural transformation on Tuesday, January 11, 2022 at online Zoom forum. Okay, before I move to the main agenda, I would like to remind you once again about the house rule that we must be obeyed on today's event. As I've mentioned before, first is to change your display name with format name_institution, and next to keep your microphone muted and camera on. And also there will be a question and answer session at the end of each session from the webinar. And also, I would like to mention you the several agenda that we have today, such as first, sing the national anthem. Second, we will hear the remarks from several important people who open this webinar. And third, we will hear the presentation from today's keynote lecture and continue with discussion session. Fourth, there will be a discussion session, begin with the three presentation from our three panelists today, continue with Q&A session with participants, and the last is closing. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, to opening this event, let's prepare ourselves to sing the national anthem, Indonesia Raya. Thank you to all participants. Distinguished guests, next agenda we will hear first remarks by the Director of SDG Center, University of Pajajaran. To Professor Dr. Zuziana, time is yours.
Okay, good morning to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank everyone for participating in this seminar. And let me use this opportunity to welcome and express our gratitude to Honorable Minister of Development Planning, Bappenas, distinguished speaker Professor Dani Rodrik from Harvard University, Dr. Amalia Adindinggar Widyasanti, Deputy Minister for Economic Affairs at Bappenas, Dr. Maria Monica Wiharja from World Bank, Professor Harun from University of Cape Town, the distinguished moderators of Professor Hatip Basri, Senior Lecturer at the Faculty of Economics and Business University of Indonesia and former Minister of Finance and former Chair Investment Coordinating Board of Indonesia, Professor Arif Ansari Yusuf from SDG Center, Universitas Pajajaran, and of course, all participants joining this webinar. I would like to say that it is our privilege and pleasure to have this opportunity to host this seminar. As you may be aware, this seminar is a result of collaboration between SDG Center UNPAD with various institutions, namely Bappenas, Forum Kajian Ketenagakerjaan, and Indonesian Bureau of Economic Research. For your information, SDG Center UNPAD is the first SDG Center in Indonesia. SDG Center of Universitas Pajajaran seeks to play the strategic role to help Indonesia achieve SDGs in 2030. SDG Center of Universitas Pajajaran is a venue for multidisciplinary research related to SDGs at global, national, and local scale. It serves to facilitate a sharing of SDGs related research finding from both the university and its partners. It also facilitates capacity building to enhance the analytical capacity of academic community and policymakers from national and local level to conduct SDGs related analysis. Our vision is Indonesian achieving SDGs in 2030, and our missions are providing evidence-based policy recommendations to achieve SDGs, independently monitoring progress of SDGs, mainstreaming SDGs into research and policies, and facilitating dialogues to achieve SDGs. Our main activities include independent studies, publications, training, research collaborations, networking, and facilitation, and conference, workshops, and seminars. For us, this seminar is important because good job is instrumental in achieving most of the SDGs agenda, particularly SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, and other relevant SDGs such as SDG 1 on zero poverty and SDG 10 on reduce inequality. We at the SDG Center has done various work in assisting Indonesia government in their SDGs agenda. Lack of decent work is even more urgent in today's COVID-19 recovery because we start seeing the risks of scarring in our job market. So any fresh ideas to help us deal with these upcoming risks, like in this seminar, are urgently needed. We really hope that this seminar will coming up with ideas that can be implemented, especially in Indonesia. Enjoy the seminar and have a fruitful discussion. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Zuzi, for the incredible remarks that awakening us this lovely morning. Once again, to all participants, we're waiting for another participant, or maybe you can also invite your friends from the link for the registration, or maybe you can also watch us from our YouTube channel. Before we start and move to the main agenda, I would like once again to tell you about the house rules that we must obey on today's event. First is we would like to change, or we please you to change your format for the rename is name_institution. And next is we can also remind you that if you have another questions that you have get ready for, don't you worry, you can send it when the mode for the Q&A session. Therefore, if you'd like to ask some question, you can write down your question on the chat box, and not to forget to mention your name and also institution. Or maybe you can click the raise hand feature at the participant, and after the moderator pick the questioner, please unmute your microphone. And the last is, because we are in the international webinar, we please you try to use English first, but don't you worry, you can also use Bahasa, and I will help you to translate it. All right, that's all the house rule that every participant must obey. I hope you can understand it. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's moving forward to the main agenda. But before we start it, I would like to thank to our following institution as co-organizer who has supported this event. They are SDG Center Unpad, Kementerian PPN or Bappenas, Forum Kebijakan Ketenagakerjaan, and Indonesia Bureau of Economic Research. So the honorable participant, as we know, today's webinar begin with presentation from our special keynote lecture. But before that, I would like to introduce you to the moderator who will lead this first discussion session. He is senior lecturer at the Faculty of Economic and Business of University Indonesia, a former Minister of Finance, and also former Chair Investment Coordinating Board of Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Muhammad Hatib Basri. Good morning, Dr. Hatib.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
A very good morning to all of you. Good evening to Professor Roderick. First of all, I have to apologize that we start a little bit late, and I understand that Danny, you should leave at around 9 p.m. Your time. So probably we will see how it goes. You can have the presentation for about 25 and half an hour, and we'll see if there is a time for that. We will have the discussion. Yeah, but let me open the discussion. It is very interesting to look at the success story of the East Asian and Southeast Asian economies in the 1990s, because it was a story about the connection between trade and industrialization. And if you look at the case of Indonesia, strong low-cost manufacturing exports contributed to Indonesia rapid economic growth in the mid-80s until before the Asian financial crisis. However, we have seen that the world is changing because the technological disruption, the product cycle is becoming increasingly short. At the same time, the growing middle class and also political transformation into a democratic system make it difficult for various countries to stick in the same recipe. So the question is, can we use the same recipe again, or do developing countries need to alter their development strategy? And what is the new strategy if it does? Can we skip the manufacturing and go to the services sector? So we are very fortunate this morning to have Professor Danny Roderick of the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Roderick is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard University. I always admire his work, and his book of The Globalization Paradox is widely regarded as one of the most influential works on globalization. I recall, Danny, when I was in the government, I had a meeting with Pascal Lamy, and he suggested me to read your book. At that time, he was the DG for the WTO. It was intriguing that there's a recommendation come from the DG himself about deglobalization. So without further ado, Danny, the screen is yours. You can have your presentation, and then we'll see how it goes, whether we do have time for the Q&A later on.
Thank you, Dr. Hatib Basri. It's very good to see you online, and thank you, everybody. Good morning to all of you. I'm going to try to share my screen. We've started somewhat late, so in order to leave time for a little bit of discussion at least. I'm going to try to run through my presentation rather quickly. But to get to the point and answer the question that our moderator posed as to whether times are changing and we need a different development strategy, I have come to believe that the tried and tested model of export-oriented industrialization is no longer a feasible path for generating durable and equitable and inclusive economic development for even low-income countries, really, at this point. And clearly, Indonesia is a middle-income country where I think reinvigorating and fostering significant increase in manufacturing employment is going to be, I think, very difficult under current conditions of technology and globalization. And so I do think increasingly that we need a different kind of a development strategy. I am not exactly sure what that alternative is. I'm just going to give you a few hints of where my thinking is. But I hope it will stimulate your own thinking in the context of Indonesia about what the implications are for the issues and problems that you face. I think the fundamental problem is that patterns of structural transformation today look very different than they used to look traditionally. And I think they're becoming increasingly problematic to generate decent jobs, good jobs, or middle-class jobs, what I will call sort of, for short, good jobs, which is a critical component of an inclusive development strategy. And I'll talk about why industrialization in earlier period made that possible, but now it's no longer is doing that. The discussion is very closely linked to the discussion in the literature on premature deindustrialization, the literature on which I have written about, that shows that increasingly developing countries are finding it harder to industrialize, and in some sense, repeating the experience of the East Asian tigers, and even more recently, cases like Vietnam is becoming increasingly difficult. This picture from a recent World Bank report on Indonesia compares the share of manufacturing in Indonesia to a number of other countries and time trends. The general trend is downward, and the trend would look even more striking if one focused at employment, which I think is really the critical issue in terms of the ability of manufacturing to generate employment. And I think one way to summarize this change in the patterns of structural transformation is to compare the traditional development model with what's increasingly happening today. So if we divide the economy sectorally amongst agriculture, manufacturing, services, but perhaps more importantly, from an economic standpoint, between an informal versus an organized part, with the informality associated with low productivity and low productive trajectories, and the organized or the formal part of the economy associated with more productivity and more productive convergent labor productivity trajectories with the more advanced countries. The sort of the traditional development model is that we move people, workers, from the informal parts of the economy, mostly in the countryside, first into manufacturing in the urban areas, but increasingly into organized manufacturing. And then, of course, then there is a transformation into services later in the development process. What is happening in most developing countries today actually looks very different. It's not that people aren't leaving the countryside. Urbanization is still happening in general quite rapidly, but for the most part, the movement is into services in the urban areas, but more critically, it's a movement into services that are relatively low productivity, informal, unorganized, and on relatively poor productivity trajectories. So the thickest arrow here is really sort of still remaining within informality, and the movement into organized, rapidly productivity increasing manufacturing is relatively a thin arrow here. So the two things here, the two critical features here, is both this process of premature deindustrialization, and also that even within manufacturing industry, when we look at many low-income countries today, is the dominance of informality within manufacturing, which is what we increasingly see, for example, in low-income Africa. Now, what's happening with respect to employment in manufacturing is really quite a global phenomenon. And if we look at even in countries that have managed to succeed either to keep manufacturing output at constant prices relatively stable in relation to GDP, or even in some cases like South Korea, where in fact at constant prices, the share of manufacturing value added has increased in relation to GDP. Regardless, employment in manufacturing has been trending downwards in all of these countries. So if you look at the blue line here, which is the share of manufacturing employment, total employment, virtually everywhere it is trending down in recent years, even as I said, in cases like South Korea, where in fact manufacturing has increased its share in GDP at constant prices. This is associated with a pattern of technological change that is global, that is a pattern of technological change that is increasingly economized on low-skilled labor. That is a pattern of global technological change, which is skill-intensive, there's skill-biased, or biased towards capital, so that the share of low-skilled labor in manufacturing value added has been declining throughout the world, reflecting this pattern of technological change. Global value chains, globalization is actually an important vehicle through which this technological change is being transmitted to the markets of developing countries, so that if you look at what's happening to labor demand within global value chains, you see that bias being reflected in global value chains as well, with the share of low-educated workers increasingly declining in global value chains. So what does that mean in terms of development prospects and employment and the generation of good jobs, productive jobs in the developing countries? I'm not going to run through the formal apparatus. There's a there's essentially a kind of a triple shock on the prospects for employment generation that these global technological trends produce. On the one hand, there is a direct employment loss due to in manufacturing, which results from the fact that essentially these skill-biased technological change in manufacturing reduces the comparative advantage of low and middle income countries in manufacturing products. So that's adverse comparative advantage effect that naturally depresses the levels of output, manufacturing output, that translates into less ability to absorb employment. Second, there is in fact a magnified effect on employment beyond the output loss, because remember that any output that remains competitive is now operating at much more skill-intensive and capital-intensive techniques, and therefore it's actually utilizing a lot less labor. And therefore there's an additional employment loss due to the shift towards more skill-intensive and capital-intensive techniques. And furthermore, the third whammy here is that there is a kind of a loss in employment buoyancy, is that the ability of employment to respond to positive shocks is reduced because positive profitability shocks in manufacturing essentially translate into lower employment responses. In other words, there is a steeper cost curve due to the fact that a more skill and capital intensive technique implies that there is relative scarcity of capital and complements to capital, such as skills, which makes it much harder for output and employment to respond to positive profitability shocks. When you put all of these things together, I think the general picture that emerges is that it becomes very difficult for manufacturing, export-oriented or not, to not only act as an engine of very rapid growth and very rapid convergence, but also as a vehicle for pulling a lot of labor into organized, formal, more productive activities in the urban areas. So that is the basis of my argument as to why manufacturing is no longer able to play this role of driving very rapid growth and convergence, and even less of a role in terms of absorbing labor into higher productivity activities. So the question, therefore, that arises is, are there alternatives to industrialization-driven growth? After all, sort of rapid convergence driven by industrialization has been the classic mode of rapid economic growth. Of course, it's from the Industrial Revolution and then the subsequent catch-up in Western Europe, in the United States, in Japan, after the Second World War with the East Asian tigers and so forth. Most of the countries that achieved rapid catch-up did so through rapid industrialization. So the question is, are there alternatives? Now, in order to answer the question of whether there are alternatives, one has to have a very good understanding of why manufacturing was special and why industrialization played this special role. I think there are three reasons why manufacturing has historically been special. One is the productivity dynamics within manufacturing, that for a variety of reasons, that modern factories have been rather good in terms of converging to productivity levels in the frontier economies. So it's been relatively easy to converge to productivity. So in technical economic terms, there's been really unconditional convergence in manufacturing, unlike many other parts of the economy. So one thing is that productivity dynamics, copying and absorbing and utilizing manufacturing technology is relatively straightforward. Second, that traditionally manufacturing has had this labor absorption capacity because manufacturing has traditionally been intensive in low-skilled labor, so that it has not been limited on the supply side, that it has been relatively easy for manufacturing to expand because it relies on a factor of production which is actually abundant in most low-income countries, which is relatively low-skilled labor. And third, tradability means that not only is manufacturing traditionally not constrained on the supply side because it has access to an abundant input, but it also is not constrained on the demand side because manufacturing is tradable and therefore you can actually export to world markets. The size of the domestic manufacturing is not constrained by the size of the home market and therefore the size of, by the level of incomes. In other words, by the level of productivity in the rest of the economy. So that the combination of these three things make manufacturing a very potent a force for rapid economic growth, or a very steep escalator for convergence. Now, of course, what's different now is we've lost number two. The changes I've been talking about are about really how manufacturing is no longer labor absorbing, no longer absorbing low-skilled labor, and therefore this is the main thing that has changed. So when therefore we look at alternatives, we need to evaluate whether those alternatives, namely agriculture and services, can fill those functions that manufacturing combined in earlier periods. Now, in terms of agriculture, I think without question, there are significant productivity gains that are possible in traditional agriculture, significant possibilities for diversification in agriculture. And many low-income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, have managed to experience rapid productivity growth in agriculture. So I do not deny the possibility that there might be significant possibilities for productivity growth. But it's very difficult to imagine agriculture as a sector that will absorb increasing shares of the labor in the economy. So agriculture, particularly if you manage to increase its productivity, will be releasing labor. And therefore the question arises, where will that labor go? So agriculture cannot be the solution to this conundrum of which higher productivity activities do we put labor into. With respect to services, now services come very loosely in two types. There is a higher productivity and often tradable segment of services, which share with manufacturing some of the productivity dynamics and productivity trajectories. They also share with manufacturing that they're often tradable, like IT or finance or business services, BPO, and so forth. But the main problem of this higher productivity tradable services is that they're generally very skill intensive. I think tourism is really the only exception here, but most of these services are relatively skill intensive, and even countries like India and the Philippines that have developed relatively large sectors of tradable services have found that these sectors really cannot be the engine of growth, certainly not the engine of generating a lot of employment, because there's a very large gap between the type of labor that these economies have and the type of labor or the type of skills that these tradable services need. So that leaves really these low productivity, non-tradable, informal, inorganized household, retail, and other kind of petty services in the urban areas, which today are by default the sources of employment growth, whereas the sectors that are absorbing employment. But because these sectors are not tradable, they cannot individually act as growth poles in the way that a tradable manufacturing sector in the past could, because these sectors cannot expand very rapidly without simultaneously other parts of the economy expanding at the same time, because otherwise profitability in their terms of trade will decline, given that they are limited, constrained to the home market. So, these the relatively pessimistic conclusion that I get out of this is that the ceiling on rapid economic growth has been lowered for most developing countries, or the possibilities of rapid convergence are being restrained by the fact that export-oriented or industrialization in general is no longer going to act as a potent engine as it has in the past. Now, with respect to the issue of sort of development strategy, when we ask the question, given that background, given these sort of considerations, how do we act? I think the key question that we will need to answer when we think about development strategy in the near future is the question of where will the good jobs, or the jobs that are relatively more productive, going to come from? Okay? So this traditional role that manufacturing played in generating good jobs is no longer going to be played, and therefore it's almost to me, a kind of a mathematical certainty that there will have to be much greater role played in the future in creating better jobs, more productive jobs, by mostly domestic kind of services, these services that remain for the most part very low productivity today. And when you think about what that means, is that it makes actually sort of two different dimensions of development policy, growth policy on the one hand, and social policy on the other, increasingly one and the same, because essentially, given the limitations of industrialization and the role that trade can play, we really cannot have robust growth without creating productive jobs and expanding the middle class. So growth will have to rely increasingly on creating broader economic opportunity for the poorer and the lower middle classes. So that's one dimension of how social policy and growth policy are now becoming more one and the same. On the other hand, of course, we cannot really address the structural factors behind poverty and inequality without creating good jobs for relatively low-skilled kind of workers. So social policy requires growth, which requires good, more productive jobs. Growth requires better jobs, which is the way that you actually also can address issues of poverty and inequality. And of course, good jobs are going to require good firms. So that means that those household enterprises, retail, informal establishments, they will have to become more productive in order to be able to provide more and better jobs. So I think the general strategy here is going to call for a kind of a mix of interventions on both the supply and demand sides of the labor market. On the one hand, of course, policies of education and training are important. So skilling up the labor force, of course, is always part of the solution to this problem. But that cannot be enough if, on the demand side of the supply of the labor market, you don't have an expanding and enough good firms, good establishments that are actually want to hire workers. So you will need to also prop up, stimulate, and think about how you can increase demand for the kind of workers that you have. And that's going to actually require, I think, thinking in terms of a new kind of industrial policy that is targeted much less on the sort of the growth champions and the global value chains and the manufacturing and the large firms and the exporters, but much more on the sort of middle segment firms, lower and smaller firms, often informal household enterprises that have the potential to increase productivity and employment at the same time. It's a very different and, in fact, in many ways, much more challenging type of industrial policy, I believe. So, so to put sort of, where I think the emphasis will need to move, let me try to present this in a kind of a schematic way. Using this matrix, which is sort of one way of thinking about where we locate different types of policies. So this matrix asks two types of questions. One is sort of what is the stage of the economy where we intervene pre-production, at the production stages, post-production, and then along the rows, what segment of the economy do we care about? Do we focus on the lowest productivity, the middle productivity, or higher productivity segment? So the traditional poverty reduction and social protection model essentially combines, on the one hand, sort of investments in education and training. So these are the lowest productivity segments of the economy, but also the pre-production, with post-production redistribution through cash transfers, and also with appropriate full employment macroeconomic policies. And of course, the safety nets also, and the social insurance policies that can help middle classes as well. So that's the traditional poverty reduction and social protection model. The traditional model of industrial and growth policies focuses on a very different type of set of interventions and a very different segment of the economy. So they are mostly on the sort of the higher productivity segment, and they span a variety of policies like subsidies, R&D incentives, tax incentives, innovation systems, intellectual property rights, trade agreements, and so forth, that are really trying to bolster and expand the most productive parts of the economy. And this is typically where sort of most industrial policies in the past have focused. What I'm saying with respect to where I think our emphasis will need to to shift is in this sort of middle cell. This middle cell, which is sort of the more sort of the mid segment of the economy, the more middle productivity segment. And it's this with a focus on promoting higher quality jobs in smaller and medium-sized enterprises by combining both training policies, but also policies that promote productivity in this segment of firms through a variety of customized business incentives and services. So one thing that we know from the types of business incentives that actually work, they tend to rely much more on providing particular services to firms, whether it's training, whether it's help with zoning, whether it's help with management, whether it's help with the acquisition of technology, whether it's help with sort of management, and much less with actually sort of, you know, tax incentives or subsidies. Those tend to be very costly, and they tend to be not particularly effective. So the kinds of incentives that work tend to be customized to the needs of the firms themselves. They require, they entail continued collaboration and iterative target setting and revision of both employment and other goals. So it's a different type of industrial policy that is much more collaborative with different parts of the private sector. Now, we know how these things work. In other segments of the economy, we have much less experience with this in the smaller and medium-sized segment of the economy. But I think that's increasingly where industrial policies will need to move. It's a very different type of development strategy or trade and industrial strategy than the one that focuses on promoting manufacturing for exports or promoting inserting the economy into global value chains and so forth. And the reason why I think we need this kind of an alternative framework is because I just don't see how those strategies of relying on global value chains, on international trade, on exports, on manufacturers will be able to generate the kinds of more productive jobs in sufficient quantity that the kinds of economies that most low and middle income countries actually do need. And I think that's really where we need this sort of repositioning of our thinking on development. So let me just stop here. I realize that if we take these ideas seriously, they actually raise a lot of new and other sort of questions that we need to think through. But that's at least where my own thinking is right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny. This is really eye-opening because as many economists still believe that we should continue on this manufacturing sector. So before we continue, let me ask you first, do you still have time or you have to leave? This is 9 p.m. now, or you want to entertain one or two questions?
Maybe I can do. My wife is waiting for me, so maybe a couple of questions I can take. But yeah, we can.
Okay, thanks so much, Danny. I see that Darendra, there is a question from Darendra Wardana. Yeah, let me read his question to you. Dear Professor Roderick, many thanks indeed for the presentation. I would like to hear from you when we take into account environment variables like clean energy. Hello? Oh, sorry, I lost it. Okay, so when we take into account environment variables like clean energy, emission reduction, etc., which almost invariably runs counter with the industrialization in general, does it, in your view, affect negatively or positively to the good job creation, particularly within the context of developing or middle-income countries? You want to respond?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think actually the perspective that I've tried to bring to bear on this question makes the greening of the economy less of a problem from the standpoint of growth and employment generation than it would be if you continue to think that countries need to replicate the kind of the kind of industrialization process that earlier generations of countries did, where there would be maybe a kind of a clearer tension between the need to industrialize and the need to decarbonize. But what I'm saying is, because we cannot rely on industrialization to spearhead the economy, the tension, in fact, is alleviated, because we can look then at the challenge of greening the economy and decarbonizing the economy as a way of actually complementing the employment focus. Because I think many of these green investments, for example, sort of a lot of the refurbishing of our urban infrastructure and our urban transport systems, are going to require a lot of job creation, at least sort of transitionally. So a lot of these things, I think, can be friendly to employment, to growth, and to the climate at the same time. So I think if we focus less on industrialization, on the classic industrialization model, as what's really going to drive economic growth and employment in the future, I think the challenge of the climate transition also starts to look less like a problem and more of an opportunity for investing in new areas and creating jobs in new areas. So to that extent, I'm not at all concerned that decarbonization might act as a tax on industrialization today, because that's not where I think the future is in any case, even for low and middle income countries.
Thank you, Danny. Let me, if it's okay, let me continue with the second question. Would that be okay, Danny? Yeah.
Yes. Let's take one more.
Former student. He's a big fan of you. Thank you very much, Pak Roderick, for speaking here. I'm a big fan of you. The issue with domestic services is that you mentioned they do not necessarily exhibit the unconditional convergence that manufacturing has. In addition, tradability is lower, hard to export services. Wouldn't it be better to drive manufacturing growth with the assumption that the growth will spill over to other sectors of the economy? You want to respond?
So I think, So I think the fact that these domestic services lack the unconditional convergence and tradability is precisely the reason why I think the underlying, maximum possible growth rate for the developing world is now somewhat lower than in the past. So what I'm saying is, precisely because we will have to have a growth model that's much more driven by domestic services, it's going to be unrealistic to expect growth rates of 7-8% of the type that many East and Southeast Asian countries experienced in the past on a sustained basis, because those were driven very much by the possibilities of industrialization and sort of the export surplus, and being able to rely both on the technology transfer and then on sort of a narrow segment of exports that drove growth. Now, this alternative model that's going to be services doesn't allow that, which means that we're talking about growth rates that might be at best 4 or 5%, and therefore, so that's, I think, we need to understand that our fundamental growth horizon has been lowered by that. And that will still produce some healthy convergence with the developing world, with the developed world. So the convergence will still be possible. But I don't think growth miracles of the East Asian type will be possible. So that's point number one. So once we understand that, then we say, okay, we're operating necessarily on a lower growth trajectory. It's not a disaster. It's not the end of the world. So the question is, how do we make that lower growth trajectory one that is going to be much more inclusive and much more friendly to generating good jobs and decent jobs for an increasing number of people? And that's why we then have to say, okay, we need to work with what we have, and these are going to be mostly domestic services. And even though they're not tradable, even though increasing their productivity en masse is much harder, we still have to do what we have to do to do the best that we can do there, because that's honestly, I mean, that's what we have to work with.
Thank you, Danny. Let me know if you have to leave because you got so many questions here. The next.
I'm afraid I'll have to excuse myself. So I'm sorry that I don't have, I'm not able to have more, but I look forward to hearing about your discussions and any feedback I hear from would be very helpful for me.
Thank you very much, Danny. So you have to leave now. If that's the case, then on behalf of the organizer, let me thank you and let me invite everyone to give a virtual applause to Professor Danny Roderick for the excellent keynote speech. I believe will be very useful for all of us and looking forward for the further discussion on this particular issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day. Thanks for having me and listening to me. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. So let me return to the MC. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hati, for guiding the first discussion session, and also thank you so much for Prof. Danny for material presentation on today's webinar, which was very impressive and full of insight. Once again, thank you very much for your opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, it was such an honor for us. We have a guest from the Ministry, the Honorable Minister of National Development Planning, or Bappenas of the Republic of Indonesia, Dr. H.C. Suarso Monoarfa. I inform you that Dr. Suarso will have another agenda, but he will stay on this room during webinar. Once again, welcome, Dr. Suarso. Thank you for joining us. The Honorable ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned before, that today we will have two different sessions on discussion. Therefore, without further ado, next agenda we will hear the presentation from three panelists for the panel discussion within the topic Toward a Visible Structural Transformation for Indonesia 2045. As we know, this session will also be guided by our amazing moderator. Please welcome from SDG Center University of Pajajaran, Professor Arif Ansor Yusuf. Good afternoon, Professor.
Good morning still.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Without further ado, maybe to Professor Arif, time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Yamita. It is a great pleasure for us to be here. We have three distinguished panelists today. First is Dr. Maria Monica Wiharja. She's economist from the World Bank, and then Ibu Amalia Widyasanti. She will be speaking first. Ibu Amalia Widyasanti. She's a deputy economic from the Ministry of Development Planning, Bappenas, and we have Professor Harun Borat. Professor Harun Borat is a professor at Cape Town University who's doing many research on global issues regarding structural transformation and also inequality. Harun and I had a joint research project under UNU and still going on. We will be publishing 2 books, I think, from this. And particularly, I would like to thank Harun because now in Cape Town it's 3 a.m. 4, sorry, now. So really sorry about this and really appreciate your persistence. So it's pretty great honor to have you. So, but I will start with Ibu Amalia. I call her Ibu Winnie. Ibu Winnie to start with her 15 minutes presentation. Time is your Ibu Winnie.
Thank you, Pak Arif, and good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to appreciate SDG Center that have co-hosted with Bappenas as well, and with FKK and IBER to host this event. And this is a great event as we just listened from Professor Danny Roderick regarding to his new thought. Let me share my screen for this one. So this is at this opportunity, I would like to present about what is actually the national strategy for economic transformation after COVID-19 pandemic. As you know that we have some challenges in our economy, that in Indonesian economy, we know that export diversification is still low compared to our neighboring countries or peer countries. And it seems to us that the export diversification index is tend to decline across the years. And if you look at the Indonesia's export per capita is also low compared to the other countries. And if you look at China, Malaysia, and also Vietnam, that the share of export of goods and services per capita is much higher than Indonesia. The one of the biggest problem that we are now facing is actually the low total factor productivity. If you look at again compared to our peer countries, and Indonesia's economic productivity is very much lower compared to ASEAN countries. And especially after ASEAN financial crisis, it seems to us that Indonesia's total factor productivity is getting lower and lower. So I think this is one of the biggest problem because if you would like to grow higher in the future, then the total factor productivity is actually the key for an economy to grow in the long run. So the thing is that when we are in Bappenas trying to do exercises on how can Indonesia achieve our vision 2045 that we would like to become a high income economy before 2045, then our exercise shows Indonesia has to grow at on average of 6% in order to be able to escape from middle income trap before 2045. So growing at 5% is not enough for Indonesia to be able to a high income economy in 2045. So in this regard, growing at the rate of 6% is a must for Indonesia. But another question after this is, and what sources of economic growth that Indonesia have to pursue to be able to grow on the average 6% after COVID-19 pandemic. One of the key that why Indonesian productivity is quite low, one of the reason is because of low investment. Accumulated investment in machine and equipment relative low compared to the other countries. And if you look at Indonesian foreign direct investment net inflow is also low compared to the other countries. As mentioned by Pak Khatib Basri earlier, that Bappenas has undertaken growth diagnostics. And based on our growth diagnostics that we have done together with Professor Ricardo Hausman, that the most binding constraint for the Indonesian economy to grow higher is actually regulation and institution. This include low institutional quality, weak policy coordination, and also overlapping regulations. But beside the most binding constraint, we also have some other binding constraints to our economic growth. All those are infrastructure inadequacy, and also one of them is high skilled labor. There is a mismatch skill between industry needs and the supply of the labor. And the other one is the low quality of education. Our human capital is also one of the reasons why it is become the binding constraint of Indonesian economy. And the regulations in Indonesia tend to be rigid and not really quite open, especially in labor-related regulation. For example, for hiring and firing costs in labor relatively high compared to the other countries. And this implicates on high outsourcing and low number of companies that offer formal training in Indonesia. So because of low number of formal training in companies from in Indonesia, this create lower growth of human quality development in Indonesia. Another constraint is actually regulations for foreign workers. That it seems to us that regulation for foreign workers in Indonesia are complicated and expensive. Then it implicates to low foreign workers in Indonesia. If we compare to the other countries, for example, in Singapore, 1 out of 2 people in Singapore are actually international migrants, skilled worker. And in Thailand, for example, 1 out of 7 people worker in Thailand is actually international migrant skilled worker. In Indonesia, 1 out of 2,880 people in Indonesia is foreign workers. With that, as you know that, I would like to skip some other things because the time is limited. What we would like to suggest here, that one of the solution that we would like to do is that we need to provide jobs to our people, the productive jobs to Indonesian people, in order that we can improve the productivity through providing a good jobs. For that, Bappenas is now redesigning Indonesia's economic transformation agenda. Why? Because the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is actually labor switches to low productivity sectors, and this is not good for the long run growth of Indonesian economy. If you look at this diagram, that people working in agricultural sectors is higher during the COVID-19 pandemic, and this created that people moving to the lower income and lower productivity sector. And if we learn from ASEAN crisis before that, during the ASEAN crisis, 4.6 million people went back to agricultural sector during the ASEAN crisis in 1999. And for Indonesia, it needs 10 years after the ASEAN crisis to return to the pre-crisis level. And this condition is not really good if we don't want to repeat the same condition that after the crisis, we need to have 10 years to go back to the pre-crisis level. And we would like to be faster than that. We have to be able to come back to the pre-crisis level as soon as possible, as we have a vision of 2045 that we have to achieve. So another impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is that women and younger generation have a high potential getting into a new poor class. And the other one is that the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, that there is like a sign that the recovery has been slow. And the thing is that we need to accelerate this. So that's why the big task of Indonesia is to transform the Indonesian economy in order to rise the economic trajectory. The economic recovery only is not enough. Indonesian economy needs to transform to be able to grow higher in the medium to long term. And for this one, we need to improve productivity. Not only labor and capital productivity, but also we need to improve the total factor productivity that can create a higher growth in the future. So with that, there is like 6 strategies of Indonesian economic transformation agenda, which is inclusive and sustainable. And SDGs will be the main tools and the main foundation for the strategy for Indonesian economic transformation. And for the information that the 6 strategies of Indonesian economic transformation agenda after COVID-19 pandemic would be competitive human resources. The second one is that economic sector productivity. The third is green economy. The fourth is digital transformation. And the fifth, domestic economic integration. And the last one is capital city relocation. And what we have discussed with Danny Roderick today is very much relevant with the economic sector productivity. How can we provide good jobs that can improve productivity of our economy? And services or industrialization, and that would be a good discussion for us today. So how Indonesia can transform economy by improving our productivity is actually the key agenda that Indonesia need to pursue. So this is just an information that we would like to share with you. On the 3rd December 2021, our president and my minister have launched Bali's economic transformation, and the book already been published. Indonesia would like to start the economic transformation started from Bali economy, as we know that Bali is actually the province that severely impacted from the COVID-19 pandemic. That when other provinces already been recovered and Bali economy still not recovered, and there is something wrong in Bali economy because Bali is too much rely on tourism sector and make Bali's economy not resilient to the crisis or to any crisis or to any external shock that is impacted to Bali economy. So for this, Bali really the one who really needs economic transformation through economic diversification and also improving the productivity. And the 6 strategies of Bali economic transformation is to achieve a new Bali era, which is green, resilient, and prosperous. And the 6 strategies are smart and healthy Bali, making Bali productive, green Bali, and also integrated Bali, and making Bali as a smart island, and the last one is conducive Bali. So with that, Bali will be able to achieve this target by 2045. And in 2045, Bali economy will be similar to Spain's economy. And also the economic growth rate is expected to be on the average of 7 to 8% on the average to achieve the vision of 2045. I'll stop there. And the thing is that Indonesia really need economic transformation strategy, and Indonesia need to grow higher in order to be able to achieve the vision of 2045. And growing at the 5% on average is not enough for Indonesian economy to escape from the middle income trap. And with that, we need new sources and new engine of economic growth. We need to improve the productivity of our economy, and we need to find a good source, a good sectors that be able to be the sources of economic productivity of Indonesia. I'll stop there, Pak Arif, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bu Winnie, for a very timely presentation. So let me now proceed to Monica. So Monica, you can start presenting. Time is yours. Monica?
Sorry. Yeah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a privilege to be able to speak among distinguished and honorable speakers and moderators and audience. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this very important and timely webinar. Let me take this opportunity to present some findings from the World Bank's recently released Indonesia Jobs Report, Pathways to Middle-Class Jobs in Indonesia. So as Ibu Winnie already mentioned, Indonesia has a vision of becoming a thriving high-income country by 2045. But Indonesia's job quality may be preventing the country from making rapid progress towards realizing its dream. Jobs have been contributed to both growth and poverty reduction, but productivity growth is insufficient to unlock the backlog of almost half of Indonesians aspiring but unable to move to middle class. And the COVID-19 pandemic eroded many of the gains that Indonesia has made toward quality and inclusive job creation, but also provides an opportunity for Indonesia going forward to build forward better. The World Bank Indonesia's job report explores the factors holding back productivity growth and thus the creation of middle-class jobs, and offers 3 pathways to unlock these barriers. In my presentation, I will discuss 4 sections here. The first one is how the report defines middle-class job and how many are there in Indonesia. I will also go over challenges to middle-class job creation in Indonesia, and how transition to better middle-class jobs in Indonesia has been challenged because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what are some of the policy recommendations, both in the short term and medium term when the pandemic is still rife, and also long-term measures, what we call as pathways to middle-class jobs in Indonesia. So the analysis of middle-class jobs is new to the jobs literature. We define middle-class income following the World Bank's report, Indonesia's expanding the middle class, published in 2018. And given this definition of middle-class income, in this report, middle-class jobs are defined as those paying at or above a middle-class income, equivalent to about 3.8 rupiah per month in 2018 prices. With this level of income, a family of 4 consisting of 1.5 adult workers would be able to afford a middle-class way of life. In our analysis, the income data is only available for income earners that include wage employees, casual workers, and self-employed. Income data is not available for private earning employers and unpaid family workers. And this limits the analysis of middle-class jobs to about 70% of all jobs in Indonesia. But the analysis other than those related to middle-class jobs in the report includes the universe of jobs. And if variables of wages, social insurance, and benefits, as well as contract status, are included in the definition of middle-class jobs, that would cut the analysis to by about 2/3 of jobs. So as the main definition of middle-class jobs, we only include the definitions as I already mentioned above before. So in 2019, there were 127 million jobs in Indonesia, but most jobs in Indonesia are unstable and do not protect workers. In 2019, 38.2% were firm owners, and these were represented by the blue-colored pie charts in the graph. 61.8% were employees, and these were represented by the brown to cream-colored pie charts in the graph. More than half of firm owners were self-employed. 2/3 of employees were working without any contract. And even contracted wage employees face vulnerability because of low compliance in terms of receiving social protection and benefits and getting paid above the minimum wage. And among the 127 million jobs in 2019, only 15% of the 90 million who are either wage employees, casual workers, or self-employed earn a middle-class income, equivalent to about 14 million workers. Only 21% of 52 million wages earn a middle-class income, equivalent to about 11 million workers. And only 3.7 million wage employees not only earn middle-class income, but also enjoy full social benefits and hold a permanent contract. Only 8% of the 38 million casual workers and self-employed earn a middle-class income, equivalent to about 3 million workers. So Indonesia is not a story of jobless growth. In fact, in the past decade, every year Indonesia has been able to create on average about 2 million jobs and 1.8 million jobs in the last 2 decades per year. But it is a story of low productivity job growth. Productivity growth has been insufficient to unlock the backlog of almost half of Indonesians stuck in aspiring middle-class status. As you can see in the graph, most productive sectors such as financial services and manufacturing pay better wages but employ fewer workers, while less productive sectors such as agriculture and more traditional services such as wholesale retail trade, hotels and restaurants, community personnel and other services tend to pay lower wages but employ the bulk of jobs in Indonesia. We identify 5 challenges in terms of creating middle-class jobs in Indonesia. First, since the Asian financial crisis in 1997, Indonesia's structural transformation has shifted towards low-value services jobs, which are not sufficiently productive to bring people to the middle class. This is the fat arrow lines that Professor Roderick mentioned earlier in his presentation. If you see in the left-hand side graph, manufacturing used to drive industrial and overall growth, but lost momentum since the Asian financial crisis, which led to premature de-industrialization. On the right-hand side graph, it shows that labor productivity growth has been contributing the most to economic growth in Indonesia, just like many other countries. But the contribution of structural transformation or between sectors labor productivity growth is smaller compared to other countries. So labor productivity growth in Indonesia has been mainly contributed by within sector productivity growth. Secondly, lack of firm growth and firm entry constrain competition and productivity growth. As we can see in the left-hand side graph, non-agriculture firm doesn't begin to increase until a firm is about 22 years old. In other words, non-agriculture enterprises stay small in Indonesia. And on the right-hand side graph, we can see that in the manufacturing sector, jobs were increasingly absorbed by old and large firms protected from competition because of less firm entry and those who enter as small firms remain small. Thirdly, household enterprise is ubiquitous in Indonesia, employing about 70% of total employment. But low productivity of household enterprises constrains its chance to provide pathways to middle-class jobs. On the left-hand side, we can see that left-hand side graph, we can see that about 75% of Indonesia's labor market is informal, largely dominated by employment in household enterprises, both as household enterprise owners or household enterprise employees or unpaid family workers. On the right-hand side chart, we can see that only 8.5% of household enterprise owners with unpaid family workers that were below the the middle class status in 2007 were able to move up to middle class status by 2014. So this shows the low productivity of most of household enterprises in Indonesia. Fourth, majority of Indonesian labor force does not have the educations or skills required for middle-class jobs. Middle-class jobs need at least an upper secondary education or even college education. But only 41% of Indonesian workers have acquired an upper secondary education or more. On the right-hand side graph, we can see that middle-class occupations require more of analytical, cognitive, interpersonal, and digital skills, while non-middle-class occupations are more dominated by manual skills. Fifth, some group of workers face additional barriers to enter and succeed in the labor market, namely women, youth, and workers with severe disability. The graph below shows that these segments of the populations are underrepresented in middle-class jobs in Indonesia. Differences between men and women emerge during school to work transitions, with marriage and childbirth being the biggest predictors of women not making the transition to the labor market. Female labor force participation has been hovering at around 50% for the past 2 decades, compared to about 80% of male labor force participation rate. And the transitions to better quality jobs has been challenged by the impact of the COVID-19. Ibu Winnie has mentioned some of this before, but Indonesia's labor market has been hit very hard by the pandemic. Between 2019 and 2020, 300,000 jobs were destroyed, compared to about 2 million jobs created every year on average in the past decade. Unemployment rate rose to the highest value since 2009, with 10 million people unemployed by August 2020. By August 2021, unemployment rate was still about 1 percentage point higher than the pre-pandemic level in 2019. The share of middle-class jobs declined by about 5.2 percentage points, from about 15% to around 10% between 2019 and 2020, threatening the gains from Indonesia's 10 to 20 years of structural transformations in terms of creating better quality jobs. The rate of formality has increased in the last few years, but COVID-19 disrupted that trend, with stark decline for both men and women. Structural transformation was interrupted with manufacturing and high-value services jobs, experiencing a negative year-on-year growth for the first time in 6 to 7 years ago. The pandemic shifted people from higher quality employment to lower quality employment, with the share of wage employees declining by about 5 percentage points within 1 year. The pandemic potentially left a long-term scarring effect on newly graduates and youth in Indonesia. Between February 2020 and February 2021, the share of youth not in employment, education, or training increased by 8 percentage points, or almost doubled, to 16.4%. These findings highlight the potentially substantial learning and skill losses during COVID-19. The share of youth in education decreased by 2.5 and 4.5 percentage points for youth and young graduates due to learning disruptions. Youth unemployment rate decreased by 2.5 percentage point, while unemployment rate increased by 0.5 percentage point, indicating that many youth have left the labor market and become discouraged workers. Among 5.2 million graduates who entered the labor market between 2020 and early 2021, they earn about 20% less than peers graduated a year before. Informality rate increased by 6 and 13.1 percentage point among youth and young graduates. Interestingly, women entered the labor market as added workers during the pandemic. Their likelihood to become employed during the pandemic is higher than the pre-pandemic level, except for women in early childbearing ages of 19 to 29 years old, probably because of the family responsibility to take care of small children. So while COVID-19 negatively impacted men overall in terms of their likelihood to be employed, it is mostly the opposite effect for women. But many of these female added workers entered low-quality jobs. The question is whether after the pandemic is over, they will continue to stay in the labor market and improve in terms of their jobs quality. So what are the policy recommendations? Since the COVID-19 situation is still very precarious globally, and Indonesia is no exception to that, in the short and medium term, when the pandemic is still rife, the government could focus more on retaining workers, and in the more medium term, when, for example, like lockdowns measures have been lifted, the government could mix policies between job retention measures and job recovery measures. In the long term, in the longer term horizon, which is more in line with the topic that we discussed today, we offer 3 pathways to middle class jobs. Although these policy recommendations have longer term horizons, but these reforms could start now. So what are the 3 pathways to middle class jobs? First, accelerate across the board productivity growth. So this recommendation is sector blind. First,
Monica,
yep.
Could you please wrap up, please?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
First is to unlock firm entry and growth to create competition and innovation. Secondly, improve productivity of SMEs to help them grow and become better creators of middle-class jobs. And third is to tailor support to increase productivity in household enterprises where a large job exists. The second pathway is to transition jobs-friendly, transition economic activities and workers to jobs-friendly sectors and firms. First, by prioritizing investment promotion strategies in sectors and projects that are amenable to middle-class jobs. And secondly, to support job transitions through information and financing. And the third pathways is to build a middle-class workforce in Indonesia. First, by facilitating learning, and secondly, by providing tailored support to special groups. On top of the 3 pathways to middle-class jobs, the government could also continue to implement comprehensive policy interventions to close infrastructure, human capital, and financial services gap. So this is all my presentation. I encourage audience to check the report from the World Bank website. You can type pathways to middle-class jobs in Indonesia. Thank you, Pak Arif, and the audience.
Thank you, Monica. That's excellent. Now let's proceed to the last but not least presenter, Professor Harun Burak from Cape Town University. Time is yours, Harun.
Thank you very much, Arif. I'm just going to try and share my screen.
Monica, okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and apologies in advance if the lighting is bad. I'm actually not at my home at this moment. I'm sitting somewhere on the coast where the lighting is terrible. It's interesting because I had a little bit of Danny's writings to go on in terms of where I thought the seminar would go in terms of thinking, in terms of big ideas and so on. And it is fitting for me that both Amalia and Maria's presentations, I think, bring together a lot of what Danny has said in terms of how one thinks about structural transformation and where perhaps one can now innovatively or should be innovatively thinking about industrial policy, support to the employed, perhaps in a slightly non-traditional manner than we had previously. So with that, I'm really going to try and make 3 big points. One is to recast pretty much in the way that Danny has the decline of manufacturing as both a growth and jobs engine. Secondly, to look a little bit more closely, I only have 15 minutes, but to look a little bit more closely at services. Let me just start my timer. And how one can possibly think about services in the growth and employment context specific to Indonesia, but I think other developing countries, including my own South Africa. And then I want to use both of those as a platform, ironically very similar in a way that Maria has done, but perhaps in a generic way, to look at how you can look at what I've called supply side economics of a good type, almost, where you are focused on firms across the size spectrum. So Firstly, it's very, very clear that we've seen the advent of premature deindustrialization. And Danny, of course, has been instrumental in thinking about that, in writing about that. I present one data point here, if I could just find my cursor, which I can't seem to find. But in many ways, what the graphic on the left shows is, if you think, pick a perpendicular, say a log of GDP per capita at about 8, and drop a perpendicular there. What that simply says is that for a given level of GDP per capita, manufacturing's contribution to that GDP per capita over the decades from the 1980s, if you look at the different graphs, has actually declined steadily from one decade to the next. So it's almost, of course, there's premature deindustrialization, but it's almost a secular decline in manufacturing's contribution to GDP, both at the global level and, as we've seen, at the country level. Now, that has been ongoing steadily for a period of 50 years. And I think that's a really important point, given, Danny's almost, he's given up on export orientation through manufacturing as a pattern of structural transformation. I mean, he's explicitly said that. And I think the secular decline makes that very, very clear. What has happened, and I won't go into a detailed examination of it, is that, of course, technology has driven much of this, but also the replacement of manufacturing by services. And I'll come back to that a bit later. The other important thing is that manufacturing as a engine of jobs and employment generation, right? So as the, if you like, as the complement to our pattern of structural transformation, Amalia spoke about multi-factor productivity as the generator of growth. Of course, she also then speaks about employment generation coming through that. Your problem is, if you look at the this one graphic here that we've derived for other work we've done for the World Bank, is that if you look at economies across their stages of development, let's look into the far right, pick Sweden or Italy or Great Britain, their peak manufacturing employment levels as a share of total employment was much, much higher than the later industrializers like South Korea, like South Africa. I think Indonesia is in the sample as well, and Venezuela is there. And likewise, later industrializers seem to be generating far fewer jobs, even more so than middle income countries. So the basic point is that, given rising capital intensity, given the role of technology, manufacturing cannot be relied on as it used to for a given level of output to generate the same number of jobs. And I think that's a key point as well. So even if you buy into manufacturing as an engine of growth, just keep in mind, because of the role of technology, because of the servicification of manufacturing, I'll come back to that again, it cannot be relied on as a core generator of jobs, or as many jobs as industrialized economies generated from manufacturing. And for me, that is absolutely critical. So even if we put manufacturing as one of our core elements of an industrialization strategy, just remember, you're not going to get the same number of jobs that you used to before. And I think that's important. So what about services? So there's sort of a mixed bag of information here. I mean, the first thing, let's just keep in mind, is services are heterogeneous, right? Danny speaks about it as modern and traditional. You can think of it as high productivity, low productivity services. In many ways, traditional services, which are low productivity, informal sector, are the dominant form of services in most developing countries. We've seen the data for in the previous presentation by Maria for Indonesia. Most other developing countries are no different. So in other words, what drives our sort of first order understanding of services in the developing world is that these are low productivity jobs, primarily in retail, in the informal sector. The second type of services is modern services, right? That's the one that takes us, if you like, to the final stage of development. Those are in higher skilled sectors such as business process outsourcing, telecommunications, credit card recons in back offices, financial services, and so on. The public sector, this is more of a data point. Arif will recognize this in the work we've done. I mean, when you code employment by 3-digit SIC, at the 3-digit SIC level, there's always this thing called CSP, Community, Social and Personal Services. And you've got to make sure that you remove the public sector from that. Otherwise, you've got the sort of, if you like, almost a gray area in terms of how you're measuring services in the formal sector if you include the public sector. So just almost an important point about structural transformation and how you measure that. Remove the private sector, the public sector, when you start looking at services and the growth in employment that you're generating from services. Particularly important in developing countries, of course, where you can have large bloated public sectors. So how can we think about modern services in the structural transformation domain, as it were? So for me, there are two channels, two key drivers. One is what I call the intermediate services inputs role, right? So that channel is where you have a variety of services, whether they're accounting services, legal, design, marketing, logistics, distribution. Those forms of modern services serve as production inputs to our traditional sectors, right? So manufacturing, mining, and agriculture still need marketing, right? I mean, if you're selling fruit from Indonesia to the European markets, one of the most important things you need is a marketing agent, right? A marketing agent sitting in Rotterdam is selling your Indonesian fruits. That's a service, right? And they've become increasingly sophisticated, whether it's through internet portals that you doing the selling of the fruit onto large retailers in European markets. That's what services can provide and increase the returns you get and the growth you get from your traditional sectors, mining, agriculture, manufacturing, absolutely critical. So, but those intermediate services inputs depend on the dynamism in your non-services sector. So in other words, you still need a dynamic manufacturing, agriculture sector to actually kickstart those services sectors. The second modern services component of a structural transformation growth trajectory, of course, is in the ones that we're more familiar with, which is the final demand services. So those could be BPO, which is, again, sort of an Indian type story, tourism, right? Mobile phone applications, cross-border healthcare services are incredibly important, right? Same with cross-border educational services. So these sort of final demand services where you don't need manufacturing, you don't need a mining sector to be thriving or agriculture are also important. And so the extent to which industrial policy is then thinking clearly about the two channels of services, right? Particularly the final demand services, and are we appropriately focused on, as developing countries, on encouraging, incentivizing the growth of final demand services, given that we've run out of runway, employment runway in the traditional manufacturing sense, for me is absolutely critical. So I don't think though, right? You know, if one thinks like a good portfolio manager, you've got to diversify your shares. I think picking a winner, picking manufacturing or picking modern services is not for me the way to go. What government and what you know, even in our case in South Africa, my advice to the president is always make sure that we align ourselves to all possibilities where growth and employment can ensue. So in this context, in the Indonesian context, in the Asian context, one needs to think about both manufacturing, agriculture, modern services, both in terms of final demand and intermediate services inputs, and how you can align industrial policy to kickstart growth across all those areas wherever possibilities may lie. So is the employment story important? I think it is really, really important in the Asian context in relation to services. Sorry, I'm just trying to get so I can actually see my slide. The data here is essentially employment trends in services. I've taken sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, but the point I'm really trying to make in the blocks there is the extent to which, and it's the point I made earlier, if you take Asia, the share of the change is what's really important. So I look at the period 1990 to 2018 and ask the question, how many jobs have been created across these different sectors? and I've broken it down into let's call it the traditional sectors and services sectors. That 40 odd percent, was it 43.3% data point for Asia suggests that over the period 1990 to 2018, 43% of all jobs created in Asia, right, emanated from wholesale and retail. And of course, the overwhelming majority of that is in low productivity services jobs. The point that was made earlier in the previous presentation by Maria. So what you do find, and just as an interesting point, look at that 19.5 below it, that's government services. So 20% of all jobs, right, could be assumed to have been generated in Asia from the services sector. No, that's the public sector, right? So I think just keep those sort of data idiosyncrasies with services in mind. In essence, though, you are getting jobs generated predominantly through the services sectors in both sub-Saharan Africa, my continent, but also in Asia. That's not unusual. The question is when you look at the services component, where it's clear that services sectors are the drivers of employment relative to manufacturing. If you look at manufacturing share of employment, only 15%. The question then has to be, how can you think about a growth and employment strategy that appropriately includes the services sectors? I can't seem to. Okay. So with that, and I've got 2 more slides, Arif, if that's okay. I think I've got about 3 more minutes. So I thought, let me just step back, and again, how can one think of what I've called developing countries supply side economics, or how can you think about a policy response that's a little bit more attuned to the way in which structural transformation or growth patterns are occurring in an economy? So for me, and it's something Danny and I have actually spoken about before, it's a pity Danny's not on the call still, is that one can think of, in one conception of it, policy support as being, and I'll show the grid in the next slide, as being organized according to firm size and by different types of policy support. And the reason is that on the firm size continuum, if you think of this notion of middle class jobs or low productivity jobs, is that essentially it's a reflection of a firm ranging from a one-person survivalist enterprise to perhaps still an informal firm that has some employees, right through to a formal, medium, and then very large enterprise. So across that firm size continuum, there's of course a realization that the kind of policy support you will need for each of those firm size categories has to be different. And so the challenge for policy is to segment its policy support and incentive packages and so on towards those different firm sizes. So what do I mean? And here's an example. So I've created a grid here that generates, firstly, that looks at firms across the columns from own account to micro, small, medium, and large firms. And then you can see that there are different types of composite policy packages. It can be, what's the regulation that you may require to change? What's the infrastructure requirement for the firm? Supply side incentives, and then there may be fiscal outlays that fall out of each of these. But here's one simple example. In the infrastructure case, for an own account worker, right, or the informal sector, it may be simply things like storage space, right, to keep goods and services. This is Danny's point about social policy meets industrial policy. So we've often thought of this as poverty support for the informal sector. Well, if you think of non-productive services as your employment generator, find the space to actually provide a policy anchor and policy support for those firms. And storage space, whether it's transport and access to land, maybe even ablution facilities for the informal sector, is a key part of firm support, right? But that can be very different if we go to the far right for a large firm. For a large firm, infrastructure is about efficient port services. It's about regular supply of energy. It's about quality access of road infrastructure and so on. But across the continuum, the infrastructure support that policy needs to provide will differ. If one looks at supply side incentives, it's possible that you want wage subsidies or skill support for survivalist firms, but you may be wanting to think about EPZs for larger firms. I think, for example, in Amalia's presentation, you've got the entire gamut of really innovative policy support. I would say, well, then, how about one organizes this according to the typology of firm that you want to target? And then perhaps within that, whether it's non-productive services, manufacturing, or agriculture. And I think out of that can come really innovative and very carefully targeted services. I think the danger is when we go to the informal sector, Arif knows from the work we've done together, when you go to the informal sector, you think of household support, you think of social grants, and in fact, you need to take it out of that domain and put it into the domain of the firm where you can provide that kind of support. So in conclusion, I mean, we know that the manufacturing boat has sailed, if you like, as a key contributor to structural transformation and long-run development, as the magic bullet, if you like. I think it's still part of the armory, but it's not the magic bullet it used to be, which means we have to start looking at services. I think be careful about the public sector, so park that in our data sense, but in most cases, for me, it's a combination of modern services, both direct and indirect, and then lest we forget paying attention to what we would call the informal sector or low productivity services sectors, and how we can think of a matrix of policy support for that sector and those across the firm size range. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Harun. Now we come to the Q&A sessions, and I really understand if Harun would like to leave early, but before that, I would like to entertain just one question for Harun. At least some of you may be not aware, in Cape Town is 6 a.m. now. So related to that, there is last question from there is a question from Susiati related to job automation. Automation. Yeah? I believe that you have been doing research on this in South Africa and perhaps other countries, and I'm quite sure that there are some resemblance of what happened in your country or some other country in outside Indonesia that can be relevant to us. So, can you say something about this, Harun?
Yeah, so I think it's something I didn't actually touch on, given the time limit. I mean, what's happened? So the capital intensity of manufacturing has effect. Yes, there've been job losses, but at least from a significant number of developing countries, including your own, Arif, has shown that it's jobs in the middle of the occupational distribution that have been lost. So in other words, the machines have come and capital replacement has come for those tasks that are repetitive, those tasks that are easily to replace by machines, and those tend to be jobs in the middle of the distribution. So if one thinks of a simple factory floor, the person sweeping the floor, their job actually has been protected because machines have thus far found it difficult to replace sort of those non-repetitive manual kind of jobs. Of course, cognitive jobs are high-end. Machines find it impossible to actually replace them. And it's those people who are in the factory floor putting things into a box, right? Those are repetitive tasks. It's a very common literature in the US where we've seen this, in Europe. But I think what's worrying is that, particularly for global value chain type firms, that pattern's been replicated in developing countries.
Thank you, Harun. So okay, if you really want to leave, we understand. Thanks again for your present here despite so many time difference.
Okay. Thank you very much, Arif, and thank you for the opportunity.
Now I'd like to invite. I'd like to invite Muhammad Faisal Furqon, I think, who is the first person who raised hand. I'm going to give opportunity to open mic. So please. Mas Furqon. Okay. sorry. So now maybe sorry, there is some. Okay, so maybe I'm just reading. Just to read some of the question here. For Ibu Monica and Ibu Winnie, you can read here in the Q&A sessions. Could you perhaps expand on the sector-specific support for economic transformation and middle-class job creations? What are some of the tangible policy intervention that you have in mind, aside from the business-as-usual policies that government already carries out? For example, tax incentive for certain sectors. Moreover, with government limited fiscal space, is there any policy option to support this path that doesn't involve fiscal spending? Maybe Monica first, and then Ibu Winnie.
Yeah, thank you, Dimas, for your questions. So I guess in terms of your questions on sector-specific recommendations, I think what we propose in the report is that, and I guess this is in line also with what Professor Roderick and Professor Burak have said. I think we have to tackle it from both the demand and supply sides. First, I think there are some policy interventions that are sector blind. So regardless of sectors they're in, I think we need to have those reforms. And as I mean, in the context of Indonesia, as already presented in my presentation, I think the government could focus more on creating not only like just any jobs, but jobs that that are of better quality. And some of the I guess like sector blind policy recommendations could include how we can unlock new firm entry and growth to create competitions and innovations that spur productivity and private sector. And I completely agree with both recommendations from Professor Daniel Rodrigues and Professor Burak in terms of there are specific recommendations for firms from the demand side for firms of different size, right? And as already presented before, how do we, for example, like policy recommendations could target how to grow small medium enterprises to become larger enterprises, and to be better creators of middle class jobs, and then and household enterprises, as we all know, are ubiquitous in Indonesia, and how to increase their productivity. So I guess that's those are like, you know, kind of like sector blind policy recommendations, but target like I guess like different types of firms with different with differentiated policies and reforms. And I think on top of sector blind policy recommendations, we could also target sector specific, not necessarily sector specific, but looking at how governments, investment promotion agencies could be operationalized to incorporate more of the good job creation lens. So instead of, for example, like I guess reforming the first order, sort of like, for example, like investment attraction challenges in Indonesia, the government could look beyond that and look not only attracting, you know, any kind of investment, but investment that create better quality jobs. So maybe and of course the third policy recommendations should come from the supply side of jobs, that is building a more skilled, more educated workforce.
Okay, thanks, Monica. Ibu Winnie, do you have any comments on those issues related to these middle class job creations? Maybe you would like to have some comments. Ibu Winnie, also maybe if you can, maybe you can also comment on the minimum wage policy, because there is one question for you, specific for you about these two. Unmute.
If you could repeat again the question, Pak, sorry.
About the sector-specific support for economic transformation, and is there any tangible policy intervention without too much fiscal space, without much fiscal need for more fiscal space? So maybe that's the first question. What's in Bapena's agenda, for example, in terms of this, if you can?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, we agree with the specific sector incentives, actually, because based on our last analysis in 2018, that the current incentive is not really effective to support the growth of manufacturing sectors. And one of the reasons is because there is no specific incentive for specific sectors. So based on our studies that and also learning from other countries' experiences, the incentives need to be sector specific, and it cannot be general incentive, because the characteristics of one sector will be different from the other one, and also size specific is also matters to provide incentives. So I think in redesigning the economic transformation agenda, we would like to move to that direction, Pak Arif, and also we hope that incentive is not only about fiscal incentive, but it could be non-fiscal incentives. And I think we already started with Undang-Undang Cipta Kerja, that some non-fiscal incentives is already started to be implemented. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think your answer is pretty much in line with also Harun suggestions, which suggest not only that we can have a sector-specific support, but also, I think if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned size-specific support. Size-specific support in the kind of matrix that Harun mentioned is I think it's kind of useful, because for the size of the sector is very relevant in terms of what kind of support that we have. Small and medium enterprise maybe need different kind of support, and then large company also need different kind of support.
Yes, I agree, but I think that matrix is very useful for Indonesia to be for that matrix can be the reference for the government.
Sure,
Indonesia.
It's pretty nice that we can always learn a new thing every day.
like for example, and it is a very concise, but also very comprehensive. I like the matrix, Arif, from Harun.
But of course, it's not that we still have a cost of doing it, because we need more monitoring and we need more information and data to be able to get it. So maybe let's go on with
one more thing, Arif, because based on what suggested by Harun on the matrix, and it is agreed that currently the government of Indonesia providing industrial zone, or we call it kawasan industry. So or special economic zone, or we call it kawasan ekonomi khusus, right? So according to what Harun mentioned, that these incentives, when the government providing industrial zone and special economic zone, is actually, that is an incentive, non-fiscal incentive, to be provided for large firms, right? So I think I really get along with what the thinking of Pak Harun, and I think this is a kind of site-specific incentive you need to be revisit again, and again we need to fine-tune again for the to make the policies more targeted in the future. Thank you, Pak Arif.
Okay. I would like to read Pak Chatur question, because Pak Chatur asked the same question during the first session, but apparently we didn't really have time to answer that. So Pak Chatur actually asked both of you a few things. First is about youth with IT related to agriculture. So what happened to agriculture? So Pak Chatur wondering how Bapenas would respond to the trend of IT going back to produce, process, and market agricultural product. That's maybe for Winnie. What is your view on how agriculture could be in the future, in this context of structural transformation? And also later on, after Winnie comment, maybe to Monica, Susana saw that young educated women choose to work in informal sector for more flexible working schedule. Many of them in creative industries. So, do you think that this trend would grow and become new alternative for Indonesian female well-educated youth? I don't know, maybe Monica first or Winnie first. Maybe Monica, you may comment on the issue of this gender-related issues.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Chatur, for the question. So from our studies surveying digital merchants in collaboration with one of Indonesia's largest marketplace platforms, we found that actually female respondents dominate the populations of digital merchants. So 56% of the respondents, weighted respondents that we surveyed, were actually female. And if you see, for example, in the case of Alibaba, a very mature e-commerce market in China, also you see that more than half of the merchants are actually female. So this shows how e-commerce has been able to attract women, and also interestingly is that from our survey, we show that more educated women than the labor force and more educated women than the male merchants are those that are selling online. So this could show that these educated women might be kind of constraints in terms of going to the labor market or returning to the labor market after maternity leave because of family responsibilities. So yes, so maybe what the Sakanas shows in terms of informal jobs for women maybe are those that are of the household enterprises working from home and using digital technologies in some of their business processes. So I don't know what the question is, but I think if we want more women to participate in the labor market and also improve in terms of jobs quality and productivity, there are like few recommendations. For example, how we can encourage more women into entering the labor market. For example, by improving childcare services in Indonesia, childcare and elderly services in Indonesia, so that they for those with small children could actually balance more of their work and life, family responsibilities, and also revisit some of our regulations and laws in regards to social norms in terms of making sure that, for example, like family responsibilities are not only the responsibilities of women, but also men. And also specific supports to help women to engage more in let's say like in e-commerce, online businesses. So maybe these are probably my short answers to Pak Chatur's question. Thank you.
Let me follow up on that, Monica,
Sure.
because there is one other interesting question from society, I think related. Is there any conclusion or analysis in the job report, the World Bank, that relate to how to move up this informal sectors to formal sectors? Is there any specifics? How can this three pathway that you mentioned at the end of your presentation relate to the how we move up this informal sector to the more formal sector or modern sector or middle class job that you mentioned in the report? Is there any specific strategy related to this? Maybe this three pathway. Can you explain more a little bit?
Yeah. So in the jobs report, although we mentioned some statistics about informal and formal jobs in Indonesia, we show, for example, like informal jobs are very much like filled with those workers in household enterprises, both as household enterprise owners or household employees. 90% of informal workers are actually those who work in household enterprises. But we, in terms of policy recommendation, we don't say much in terms of how to formalize jobs. But what we focus on is more on increasing productivity, both in the formal and informal employment. So in my own view is that formal and informal jobs will continue to exist, continue to coexist, formal and informal employment and jobs. Both formal and informal jobs will still be needed right now and in the future. So I think our focus should be increasing the productivity of informal jobs. So because some sectors, some jobs are by nature more informal than other sectors and other jobs, but that should not mean that they're less productive. So I think the focus, my recommendation is that the focus should not be on, like, for example, like formalizing jobs, but making those informal jobs more productive.
So there won't be any specific policy on formalization because it's supposed to be natural. Maybe I may simplify that with this. Okay. There is one aspect that has not been commented. I think Ibu Winnie may want to say something about this, which is agriculture. How Bapenas, or how we see agriculture, especially social transformation will maybe leave agriculture, but there is modern part of the agriculture sector. This was mentioned also by Burak, Harun as well about this. Ibu Winnie, do you have any comment on how we treat agriculture sectors? Ibu Winnie is not here. No? Oh, okay. Monica, do you have any comment on agriculture?
Yeah, I think I'm one of those, I guess, economists who believe that there's a lot of room to improve to improve productivity in the agriculture sector, that it could create more of good quality jobs. But as Professor Roderick mentioned, that productivity in agriculture sectors will actually be releasing workers instead of absorbing workers. So as we increase productivity, using technologies in the agriculture sector, we are actually going to release this sort of like excess labors in the agriculture sectors, and the question is where do they go? But certainly, I think digital technologies in the agriculture sector is one of the I guess growing and sort of like hot investment among other sectors like digital finance and e-commerce and e-logistics. So yeah, digital agriculture is is a sectors that is going to grow, in my view.
All right. Okay. Maybe last thing before, because we almost finished. I can see that from most of the presenters, Dani, Harun, Winnie, as well as you. One thing that we should remember, at sometime we forget, is that firms matters, right? So not only supply side story, but also the demand side story. So then we have to address both at the demand side and firm. So we have also firms. So this relates to the questions from Iwan Hermawan from BRIN, I believe, LIPI. Related to this, how exactly perhaps the role of firms in order to match the middle class jobs with the structural conditions of the middle class society itself. Maybe Monica can a little bit more elaborate about firm specific targeted policy that we need. I'm sure it's there in the job report, but maybe you can mention more about this, Monica.
Basically, I think across the presentations in today's webinar, we can all agree that the focus on creating better quality jobs should come from both the supply and demand sides. And I think it's a good mix of our discussion today, discussing both the supply and demand side of productive jobs creation. In terms of how we could support firms to create better quality jobs, right? I think I would like to go back to what Professor Rodrigues has been proposing in terms of the concept and models of building a good jobs economy. That is a very close interactions in terms of reforms and policies between firms and policymakers and the government. I think this is very important, because government needs information from firms, and firms need policies from the government or policymakers. And in times of uncertainties, we cannot set, as Professor Rodrigues said in his presentation, we cannot set ex ante rules, because things are changing very fast. We need very close collaboration between the private sector, firms, and the government. And one of the things that Professor Dani Rodrigues mentioned also is how to internalize the externalities of good jobs. So if a country is not creating good jobs, not only people are not being able to be absorbed in employment, but also firms will suffer, for example, because of political instability or other externalities that will indirectly affect firms. So the question is how to make firms internalize good jobs creation. And I think in order to do that, so that it will not become very expensive for firms to be creating good jobs, firms and the government must collaborate very closely.
All right. Okay. Now, since Ibu Winnie is here with us again, so maybe Ibu Winnie may want to comment about two aspects. First is, what is your view on agriculture sector in the context of structural transformation? In the future, will still be the role of agriculture, maybe more modernized one? Yeah? That's the first issues. And the second one, if you may, can you comment as well on aspect of minimum wage policy? What is your view on these two aspects? Ibu Winnie, please.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Arif. Regarding to agricultural sector that we are expecting in the future is that, of course, that under the Indonesian economic transformation agenda, the agricultural sector should shift into a modernized agricultural sector, which is more productive. So, you know that we cannot reduce the output of the agricultural sector, but we need to improve the productivity of our agricultural sector. So, by definition, economic transformation is about improving the productivity with two channels. One is that improving productivity within sectors. So meaning that inside the agricultural sector that we need to improve its productivity, either using the modernized technology or improving the the labor productivity that is working in that sector. The second channel of economic transformation is that improving productivity by shifting from lower productivity sector into a higher productivity sector. So this is why agricultural is still important, but we need to improve the agricultural sector into a more productive and more modernized agricultural sector. I think for the second question, Pak Arif, I guess that Pak Arif more knowledgeable on this issue, and Ibu Monica for the wage policy. I think I will leave Ibu Monica or Pak Arif to answer this question. Thank you.
As a moderator, I'm not in the position, but I'm sure because Monica is the coordinator of Forum Kajian Ketenagakerjaan. Let me persist pushing on you on responding to this because this is quite sensitive too. What is your view on minimum wage?
Well, in the report, what we found is that minimum wage doesn't really affect middle class jobs creation. I think partly because of the low compliance of minimum wage in Indonesia, and the impact of minimum wage on employment, whether it's positive or negative, is still inconclusive in Indonesia. And I think we have been trying to study this further, but data regarding minimum wage that is different for each district, for each sector in the districts, makes it more difficult to do analysis or good analysis on the impact of minimum wage on employment. But in regards to creation of middle class jobs, there are other reforms that are more effective in terms of creating middle class jobs than through minimum wage regulation.
Thank you, Monica and Winnie. I think we already come to the end of the sessions. But before that, let me have a liberty of saying some highlights of this event as a somewhat, maybe you can call it closing. So first highlight, maybe I would like to say that Indonesia in the post-COVID era needs 6% growth per year to escape from the middle income trap before 2045, which is the 100 years of independence. This was specifically mentioned by Ibu Winnie in the presentation. But the challenge of having this growth is getting bigger because industrialization, which used to be the motor, the driver of this growth, more and more, less and less powerful in driving this structural transformation. That's what Danny Roderick from Harvard suggests, and then so he mentions that we need something new paradigm, new model for the structural transformation, and good job development model can be one of those new ideas. And this model basically focus on improving the job qualities, specifically in small and medium scale industries, and also linking training policy to industry, and then possibly some wage subsidy as well as more incentive and services so that companies can be more have more room for improving or growing their activities, but in somewhat more flexible approach. And then we also hear from Harun from Cape Town University the need of supporting micro and survivalist firm. Survivalist firm is those firms who have potentials to grow, but they are in the edge of cannot go on because lacking of infrastructures, lacking of basic infrastructure like storage and something like that. And also he suggests we be more specific in terms of the not only sector but on the size of company that we need to support. And of course, he also mentioned about the role of the service sectors. It is will be more prominent in the future structural transformation, and we can improve the service sector by increasing the quality of the skill that where the workers work in those sectors. Monica insists on suggests about creating employment through productivity growth. Particularly through transitions. So there is transition, so worker can move to the job, to middle class jobs through building the workforce that can be facilitated to be supported. We can facilitate so that we can support those even for specific group of workers. So to end this, so I think I can see the benang merah, all of these speakers share some similar view that the challenge of increasing the livelihood through economic growth and structural transformation now is getting more and more challenging, not only in Indonesia but in many other developing countries. But one thing for sure, I think I would like to quote Dani on this, that the strategy of improving economic growth and reduction of inequality has to be satu nafas, one breath. I don't know whether this is correct language, but has to be satu nafas, increasing growth and reducing inequality. But whatever that strategy is, we need to focus it on increasing or creating more quality jobs. I think that conclude this seminar. And again, I would like to thank all the speakers, especially Winnie and Monica, that is still present here. I would like to return the event to the MC Yamita. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Arif, who guided us such a really insightful discussion session within the three incredible panelists, Dr. Amalia, Dr. Monica, and Professor Harun. Once again, thank you so much to all distinguished webinar participants. By saying Alhamdulillah and thanks to God, we have arrived at the edge of the event today. It's a really wonderful occasion. Once again, I would like to thank for your participation, especially for our invited speaker who have shared their experiences and also their knowledge on this webinar. We hope that this discussion today could give us a lot of benefit for better Indonesia. And also we would like to give the best regard for the institution who had collaborated at this event, such as SDG Center Unpad, Kementerian PPN or Bappenas, Forum Kebijakan Ketenagakerjaan, and Indonesia Bureau of Economic Research. Last but not least, we on behalf of the committee would like to apologize if there are any shortcomings in the implementation on today's webinar. I'm Yamita Bunga as your Master of Ceremony. See you on the next occasion. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon and have a great day.
Waalaikumsalam.
Waalaikumsalam. Terima kasih semuanya.
Terima kasih semua.
Thank you, Bu Winnie. Thank you, Monica.
Bu Susi.